There is a material from World War II that honestly few historians mention, yet it arguably saved more soldiers from exposure than any standard-issued blanket or uniform. It was not exotic, not a secret weapon, and not the product of a laboratory dedicated to high-tech warfare. It was humble, often overlooked, and its benefits were fully understood only after the war had ended. The lesson it holds goes beyond history, reaching into survival, preparedness, and the quiet ways human ingenuity combats extreme conditions. Soldiers on both sides faced relentless cold and, conventional insulation repeatedly failed them. Yet this simple, overlooked insulator, woven into military logistics with little fanfare, proved more effective than anything soldiers carried as standard gear. Understanding why it worked and, why it was almost forgotten, reveals quite a lot about the intersection of necessity, resourcefulness, and human endurance in wartime. Soldiers routinely faced conditions that, honestly, standard gear just could not mitigate. In the winters of the Eastern Front, the Ardennes, and the mountainous regions of Italy, soldiers experienced temperatures well below freezing, often accompanied by wind, snow, and relentless exposure. Standard-issued wool blankets and uniform layers were bulky, heavy, and in practice, poorly suited to the realities of frontline living. Wool retains heat when dry, but loses its insulating properties when wet. Soldiers who were soaked during patrols or caught in artillery-driven storms quickly discovered that blankets, no matter how thick, provided little protection against hypothermia. It was in these contexts that the so-called forgotten insulator found its relevance. The material that outperformed blankets was cellulose-based and surprisingly simple. Engineers and quartermasters discovered that compressed cellulose fiber, commonly used in civilian insulation for buildings, could retain heat in a thin, lightweight layer. Soldiers wrapped portions of it in water-resistant coverings, often scavenged or locally produced, to create personal insulation. Unlike wool, cellulose retained its structure and insulating properties even when damp. It trapped air efficiently, and its low thermal conductivity meant that heat loss from the body was drastically reduced. Tests conducted by military engineers in late 1943, though, largely ignored in official post-war accounts, showed that a single layer of cellulose insulation could actually outperform 2 or even 3 layers of blankets in extreme cold, especially when soldiers were stationary for, extended periods. Commanders resisted its widespread adoption for, bureaucratic and logistical reasons. Despite clear evidence of effectiveness, high command on both sides was honestly pretty slow to embrace cellulose insulation. Traditional supply chains were really geared toward blankets, uniforms, and those heavy overcoats. The new material required packaging, cutting, and distribution adjustments, which, added a whole new layer of complexity to already strained logistics. There was also skepticism rooted in culture and habit. Military institutions often equated bulk with warmth, and, a light, non-traditional insulator seemed counterintuitive. Soldiers who improvised with cellulose-based wraps were seen as eccentric rather than resourceful. It was only on the fringes of the war, field hospitals, remote outposts, and winter encampments, that its benefits were observed systematically. In Scandinavian campaigns and isolated mountain operations, soldiers took matters into their own hands. They used whatever materials were available: cellulose panels from abandoned buildings, shredded paper, and even compressed fibers from packaging crates. These improvised wraps were, lightweight, portable, and actually far more effective in retaining body heat than standard blankets, especially when moisture was, unavoidable. Reports from German and Soviet soldiers note that units employing improvised cellulose insulation suffered fewer cases of frostbite during prolonged exposure. Allied officers who observed these practices began to recognize that conventional doctrine honestly underestimated the realities of human survival in the field. After the war, the lessons learned from these improvised applications did not vanish entirely. Early experiments in Arctic warfare, cold weather field operations, and even space exploration drew upon the principle that lightweight, moisture-resistant insulation that traps air is, often more critical than thick, bulky material. In the decades following the war, civilian survivalists acting independently rediscovered this approach, preferring cellulose and other similar synthetic insulators instead of relying on those heavy wool blankets. Modern sleeping bags, insulated jackets, and even emergency shelters really owe a great deal to this overlooked innovation. Yet, since it was never formally standardized during the war, mainstream historical accounts, they rarely highlight just how significant this advancement truly was. One of the most instructive aspects of this history, honestly, is not just the technical superiority of cellulose insulation, but the broader lesson it offers about human decision-making under extreme conditions. Military doctrine, after all, often places a premium on uniformity, predictability, and keeping the supply chain as simple as possible. Frontline survival, by contrast, demands adaptability and local innovation. Soldiers who recognized the practical advantages of cellulose-based insulation were operating outside formal rules, yet their choices saved lives. This tension between rigid institutional structures and improvisational survival continues to be relevant, not just in historical analysis, but in modern military planning and preparedness strategy. Understanding this forgotten insulator reframes our perception of logistical innovation in wartime. We tend to remember grand strategies, battlefield heroics, and iconic technology, tanks, aircraft, and weaponry, but much of a soldier's success and survival depends on small overlooked factors: clothing, shelter, and insulation. For those interested in survival, understanding this overlooked aspect of military history is not an academic exercise, but a practical one. It emphasizes the importance of lightweight, moisture-resistant insulation and demonstrates that improvisation using readily available materials can actually outperform standard provisions. The principle is simple: retain air, resist moisture, and minimize heat loss. From cold weather camping to disaster preparedness, these lessons remain relevant. They remind us that survival is often dictated not by what is issued, but by what is adapted in context. In conclusion, remembering these small but significant innovations matters because they offer a window into human endurance and ingenuity. The forgotten insulator of World War II is a reminder that survival depends on observation, adaptation, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. History is often written around the obvious victories, weapons, and commanders, but, it is the quiet, overlooked innovations like a simple cellulose wrap that reveal how ordinary people endure extraordinary conditions. By studying these stories, we gain not only a richer understanding of the past, but practical insights that remain relevant today. They teach us that careful observation, improvisation, and respect for human limits are as crucial to success as any strategy or weapon. If this kind of detailed, overlooked history resonates with you, consider subscribing to Iron Age Instincts. Sharing this knowledge ensures that these lessons are not lost and that we continue to value the human ingenuity that quietly shaped history.